Let's start, if we can, with just a little bit about your family background, because as I recall, you were born in East Point, not too far from downtown Atlanta.
Yes, I was born in East Point. Uh, my parents settled in East Point in 1910, and we remained in East Point until 1923. In that span of time, there were three boys and one girl, and I am the one girl born in East Point. We moved to Atlanta's southwest side, then known as South Chapel Street, perhaps 5 blocks from Spelman College. And at that point, we changed directions completely as to how we used our time and how my parents spent much of their time by way of family. I went to preschool, I guess you'd call it, at the Chadwick's orphanage, where Miss Chadwick, Miss Amy Alice Chadwick, had a program for the young ladies, the children who lived there. And after going through her program, I went to Oglethorpe Elementary School, which is on the campus of now Morris Brown College. After third grade at Oglethorpe, my family moved again, and we moved to the northeast side of Atlanta and stayed there until I finished high school at Booker T. Washington High School in 1934. In the meantime, my brothers, who were some much older, had gone through the laboratory schools at Atlanta University, Knowles High School, and then two of us went to Washington High School, and the other two brothers were of college age. One finished in the last class of Atlanta University and thus had a choice of a diploma from Atlanta University or Morehouse. The other went to Talladega, later came back and went to Morris Brown. The youngest of the boys, went to Tuskegee and was able to do some things in golfing. Golfing, and became quite well known because he was the first black to play the undergraduate golf circuit and was fortunate enough to be a winner. The city of Atlanta honored him by naming a golf course for him posthumously about 6 years ago, I guess maybe 1986 or 1987.
And what is his name?
Alfred Fountain Holmes, always known as Tup, T-U-P.
And your other brothers' names were?
One, the oldest of the boys, was a junior, Hamilton Mayo Holmes Jr. The second boy was, I guess, named out of wishful thinking. My parents wanted a lawyer in the family, so his Holmes was preceded by Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Alfred Fountain Holmes, or Tup, was named for the Fountains who were at Morris Brown College, Bishop W.A. Fountain Sr., and then his son later, William Alfred. And I was named by Mrs. Alice Duggett Carey, who was the first woman principal at Morris Brown before it became the college. Of course, it started off as university back in those days. So Mrs. Carey, who worked at Morris Brown, was instrumental in naming Alfred Fountain Holmes. She really wanted the name to be William Alfred Fountain Holmes, but they agreed on dropping the William. But my name was Alice Carey, not Alice, Duggett Carey, which was her name. But Mrs. Carey was quite a character, a very outstanding person, an authority figure, sense of presence. When you were with Miss Carey, whose specialty was Greek literature, Mrs. Carey taught at the college, was its first principal, and remained on the campus in various capacities, and at the time of her death was living in the building at March Spring. That Mrs. Carey remained a family friend. She became the first black librarian in the city of Atlanta and was instrumental in pushing for the facility. She handled the books and went during summers to Hampton to study. So she is credited with being the first black librarian, although she had no professional training at that time. That was not, librarianship was not the common thing for black women to do, well, for blacks to do. And the Auburn Avenue Library, the Auburn Avenue branch, was a Carnegie facility built for blacks, and Mrs. Carey was there for move-in day. When we moved from Chapel Street over to Boulevard in northeast Atlanta, that move put me in walking distance of the library where Mrs. Carey was the librarian. And some of my fondest memories are of going every Saturday to return 7 books and to get 7 books. Mrs. Carey was not the kind, and I'm sure she didn't do this just for me, this was just Miss Carey. When I returned the books, there was no such thing as saying, here are the books. She would say, what about this one? Why do you think so-and-so did this? In some little back portion of the book. And she was not satisfied until I was able to say that perhaps this happened because of something else having happened. And then to respond further, well, what do you think that's going to have her consider next time? Which was her way of saying to me and to others, I'm sure, that reading is just not a matter of looking at words and zipping on through, but the people who write stories have a purpose and they develop characters, and character is important in the characters which are involved in a book. And she had us to look at things of selfishness, or children who were disobedient, or parents who wanted special things. That was just not for one book, but each of the books. If she found that I wanted too many Bobbsey twins, I had to reach out and get something else. Every Saturday, 7 books. To one a day.
I was going to ask if this was one a day.
One a day.
Like an apple or,
yes,
or a vitamin.
And one of the things that I remember as a child, and I guess that was, all of us have a way of trying to do things in a tricky childlike manner. When I'd hear my daddy coming home, I would run and grab a book. And my mother, who wanted us to be aware of things that needed to be done, would call for me to come and set the table or come and do something. And it was my greatest joy to hear my daddy say, don't bother her, she's reading. I'm sure I used that for as long as I could.
This reminds me, you were mentioning your parents, that I wanted to ask too. for their names and for a description of the kind of work that they did.
Well, this is not a complicated story. My father came from Cajun territory in Louisiana, the backwoods marshland, of Marksville, which is South Louisiana, as I'm told. And he was so far back in the woods with that, and the dialect of that time was such that he spoke French dialect, that Cajun dialect, until he was eventually able to go to school. When he went to school, it was a matter of, I'm sure he was much older than the usual person would be, but he was able to move from that school in Louisiana to Leonard Medical School, which is Shaw as of now, and Shaw was one of the first of the medical training facilities, Leonard, for blacks. While he was in Raleigh, North Carolina at this school, he met my mother, who is a native of North Carolina. She was Patty Lee Reeves. And my mother was in school at St. Agnes School of Nursing on the same campus. She finished her nurse training and practiced as a nurse while he was completing his medical training. In the early spring of 1910, it was suggested in some manner, and unfortunately I don't know that we were concerned enough to ask them when they were living who proposed coming to Georgia. But my daddy and two of his classmates came to visit Atlanta to see if, in fact, they would be interested in setting up practice. The classmate of my daddy stayed in Atlanta. He was Dr. C.W. Powell, and my daddy, in visiting, decided that he liked the atmosphere of East Point. So he settled in East Point, which at that time I believe was just about 6 miles away, with the buggy transportation, of course, of a horse and wagon, or however you could move around. And that's how he settled in East Point. That's how they met and came to Georgia. The classmate, Dr. Powell, remained very friendly with my father and was scheduled to deliver each of the children. But with horses being temperamental, or buggies breaking down, or Mother Nature just saying, I can't wait for Dr. Powell, my father delivered each of his children because Dr. Powell didn't get there in time.
All four, my goodness.
All four of us. And it was, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago that I pulled out my daddy's Bible, and saw that he had written in the hour, the date, and the time, and the name for each of us in his Bible. For Black History Month in East Point, the first Black History celebration that the city has ever had, there were 11 people named as unsung heroes for their contributions to the city of East Point. And as a family, we were very honored that they went back into history and named my father as one of those unsung heroes because of his being the first black doctor in East Point. As I happened to be invited as the speaker for that Sunday afternoon occasion, and I told them a story about my daddy's entry and exit from medicine in Georgia, because to me it has some significance. When my daddy came and checked out East Point, he made the rounds, so I'm told, and visited the drugstores. They called them drugstores in those days, and talked with the pharmacist and talked with the business people and met the community people, black and white, in trying to determine where he would go and where he might find housing and all of this. Thus, he settled with two pharmacists in East Point and said, yes, I'm coming back. And when he came back, he went over to say, I'm here. The same day that my daddy actually settled into East Point, there was an emergency situation involving a young white couple. And the husband went to one of these pharmacists and said something to the effect that there was a critical need for medical help for his wife. And what do you suggest? Well, there didn't happen to be a white doctor available. And I have to say it like this because in those days in 1910, it was illegal for a black doctor to serve white patients. Excuse me. So the white pharmacist said to this couple, there is a new black doctor in town. Maybe you can get some help there. 5, 6, 8 blocks, something like that, bumpy roads because they had to cross a railroad track and go to the side of East Point that was reserved for black residents. This young couple came, and my daddy happened to be there, and they said something to the effect that I have been here and they have told me to try you. And as Daddy continued to tell us the story over and over, he said, well, I know that it's against the law for me to serve your wife. I know that she needs medical attention, but I have just taken an oath to serve mankind, and we will do what we can. And as I told this story to the congregation at East Point about a month ago, and I said, fortunately for my daddy, whatever he said worked, because there were no bad effects. When my daddy died in 1965 at the age of 82, he called me after he had finished his evening office hours. Very excited. 2 things were on his mind. First, he had been able to get his driver's license renewed, and he was very disturbed at age 82 whether they'd let him have license to continue driving. And the most exciting part of all was he wanted to tell me that as he had finished his hours that night, his last patient was a young white woman who found him and voluntarily came to seek his services down on Auburn Avenue. Then, as we talked, he related the story that I just told you and said how times have changed. This was in the neighborhood of 10 o'clock. About 1:30 that night, he had the massive heart attack and died. And my last conversation with him was how times have changed.
That is very striking.
Well, the more I work with people of all faiths and persuasions and races, I often take my daddy's words to heart. My, how times have changed. Now, you ask about how they met, and this was how they met. In the meantime, my mother gave up her nursing. Not that she could have been able to work satisfactorily, I guess, as a black nurse in East Point. But with the children, my oldest brother, Hamilton Jr., fell into a tub of water and filled his lungs with water. He was almost, I would say, drowning. My mother rescued him, and they didn't give him much chance to live, but she put her nursing skills to work, and he is now living at age 83, I guess. He came out of this with the only ill effect was that he had a stammer, which they worked with, but her time was spent then nursing her firstborn. While my mother was at nursing school, and this is something that I have been quite proud of, she was interested in making life better for black nurses. Thus, she joined with some of her fellow nurses and organized what became a national organization to promote professional growth for black nurses. To show you what a small world it is, this group of nurses came to Atlanta for a national convention about late 1930s, I guess. And listed on the cover of the program were the founders with the little asterisk saying unknown, whereabouts unknown. And my mother went to the public meeting for this group of nurses. When she got the program, she saw it. Somewhere in the event of that program, the presiding person referred to the cover, which indicated the founders. And as they said, Patty Lee Reeves' whereabouts unknown. The story is that my mother stood and said, "Here she is." When that association was dissolved as a result of organizations merging because of the various ideas people had as to why two organizations, why two water fountains, why two entrances, my mother was invited to New York for the ceremony, which did not celebrate the dissolution of the Black Association, but celebrated the opportunities which perhaps would come with all nurses, black and white, working together. That was with a luncheon at Tavern on the Green in New York. This must have been 1945, 46, something like that. She went to New York and was there for the end, just as she was there for the beginning of that. Although in the span she had not nursed professionally, but as I move around East Point now, people tell me how they could count on her to go to see about who was sick. And even after we moved into Atlanta, then they would go back out to visit regularly the people who were sick. My daddy came from this small town in Marksville, so far back in the woods, that I often tell people that a banana for him was the thing that they got at what they were told was the Christmas season. Fruit was not the common thing the way we view it now, and he said to us very often in growing up, his ambition was to have as many bananas as he wanted, whenever he wanted them. That was his childlike ambition. We saw to it, we meaning they, that he had lots of bananas, and we joked about it. That was our family joke, to be sure that Dad had some bananas.
I want to interrupt for just a second because before I lose track of it, I want to get down the name of the nursing association that your mother helped start. when it was the Black Association. Do you recall the name?
I think it must have been something like the National Association of Black Professional Nurses.
Mm-hmm.
The race was always a part of the title. It
Right.
ran the same as the White Association. But I have the certificate which she
Mhm.
was given at that time, and her letter of invitation to participate in the ceremony.
Was she also very much involved in organizational work? Because I seem to remember that you're saying she had a YWCA connection
Yes, she
as well.
was. My mother was, I guess, the old words of a do-gooder. That's what the old expression was. Because as a child, I remember that we would go, because my mother was thrifty. We had chickens and she would take the eggs to somebody, or we would go with vegetables from the garden and go see about people. While she was living in East Point, she organized, helped to organize, I should say, an organization to which I am now have an interest, in which I should say have an interest. It was called the Hyacinth Art Sewing Circle. And it was a savings club where they would put in a couple of pennies or a nickel or a dime or whatever. And as a part of their organizational structure, they did something for somebody else. One of the things that the ladies recount in their history is that this group of black women, organized in 1913, built a house for a homeless man who lived in East Point back 1915. His name, nobody knows his last name, but he was just Mr. Joe. And they built this house so that Mr. Joe would have a house. This was an organization of women who, out of their savings from butter and egg money or whatever, would do this kind of thing. When we moved into Atlanta, then my mother became involved in other things. The Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, when it was on Piedmont Avenue. She worked with the Interracial Commission, and again, that was one of those illegal acts, because at that time there was to be no mixing of the races. But I remember that our house was very often used as a meeting place. During the Depression, one of my childhood memories is of what must have been the Interracial Commission's fundraiser, and it was the soup kitchen. And for X number of pennies or dimes or whatever, they went through the soup kitchen process, but you had to pay for whatever it was you got. Interestingly enough, this brother Oliver Wendell Holmes, who did study law for a while, but later went into theology, became involved with the Georgia Council on Human Relations, which was an outgrowth of this Interracial Commission. When he came and told my mother what it was that he was going to do, then they had quite an interesting conversation about what was and what is. So she was involved in that, and because of her interest in the YWCA, I would go along with her, and I became a girl reserve. That's what they called it back for the youngsters. And we would have the camping experiences, day camp, because there were no residential camps for black girls until much later, when Mrs. Ida Prather, a real ball of fire, said, whatever anybody else has, I want my black girls to have. But Marguerite Butler and Clara Lowe, and some of those people were were the girl advisors for the Girl Reserves. So we grew up over on Piedmont, where they have now a dialysis center, and that was our building. I don't know whether the number was 75 Piedmont. I don't know, that rings a bell with me, but it was quite close to the corner of Houston Street. We would have lots of things, and my mother would work with the board for the YWCA as they would find the various directors. One of our neighbors on Chapel Street, who lived then on Tatnall Street, was Mrs. Donna Rail Green. And Mrs. Donna Rail Green was one of the, well, a current expression would be movers and shakers. She was one of the movers and shakers who brought the YWCA movement to black women. I don't know if in neighborly chats as they walked around the corner whether my mother and Mrs. Green ever worked together in getting this going, but Mrs. Donna Rail Green had quite a struggle in having the YWCA understand the need for similar services for black people. So as soon as we moved over to Boulevard,
I just do want to ask you one other question about the why, which is if you have much sense that it was typical for there to be this intergenerational connection. So your mom was involved in the why and you became involved in the why.
I think that is the case. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's what's missing in today's business, mm-hmm. that we don't have children who are following in, not that they need to follow in the footsteps of parents, but to have certain similar interests. When I finished high school, we moved back to the southwest side of town. I went to Spelman, finished Spelman, embarked on a teaching career with 1 year spent in South Georgia. Then I moved a little closer to the heart of Georgia and went to Henry County, mm-hmm. which is McDonough, and now just a short commute for Atlanta. Then I moved to Madison, Georgia, and decided after 3 years of teaching home economics that I wanted to go back to school. Mm-hmm. So I was coming to do graduate training and decided that while I was going to school, mainly taking classes at night, that I would do substitute teaching or some such in Atlanta, and was able to be what they called a permanently assigned supply teacher. 2 years of that. Then while in school, I met my husband, and that sort of redid things. We were married, and again with an effort to do some things after the war. I was moved to within just a few blocks of the new Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, which again was, as fate would have it, 3 or 4 blocks away from where Mrs. Donna Rail Green lived, the woman who had instigated much of what brought the Y around. But when I was working as a supply teacher, there were several things that I started doing. One was to work with the Atlanta Daily World, and I did that for 13 years. Started as a proofreader and receptionist, then moved into general reporting, and at the time that I was working at the Y, was the time that radio station WERD was just coming on board. That was Atlanta's first black owned and operated radio station. And I did the news wrote the news from the Atlanta World, and had a program every morning geared toward women, which was WERD's way of getting community contact. From that, I was invited to work with the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, which was then at 599 Tatnall Street, right down the street from where we lived.
If I can interrupt just for a second, because I was struck by you're saying the radio program for women, and I wondered if you'd just talk briefly about the kinds of topics that you covered and what you did during that time.
Well, we talked about all kinds of things. We would have recipes, we would have little tidbits of national news of interest to local women. We had interview sessions with various community organizations needing to get the message out. The Cancer Society, which was then beginning the Black Division. We did things with the Community Chest, which then had the Colored Division of the Community Chest. And this is dating me. It was Community Chest then, and now United Way. But in those days, you had the Colored Division of the Red Cross and the Colored Division of the Tuberculosis Association. So many of those groups were featured. This was half hour, and half hour's a long time when you've got to have something different every day. And this was not a once a week, this was every day. It was that kind of community news format, community bulletin format,
and this
which was
very
enjoyable.
This was the late 1940s, is that right? I want to be sure to date this as closely as we can.
Now my oldest daughter was born in 1944. We're talking about just at the end of the war, 45, 46, 47, something in that time frame.
And how many years did you do this for, roughly?
About 2 years. Because at that time I was the Atlanta World, the radio station, and I had moved from being just the volunteer at Phyllis Wheatley to working with the adult education program, which again was an outgrowth of saying to various community people, come on and let's do something about improving our lot in life. That put me with the 3 things at night. It's interesting how you date things, because the Atlanta World job with newspapers, you work Sundays and Mondays and holidays. And the evening work at the YWCA was when people came after their employment, so that was at night. And the radio program was early morning, so I was sort of strung out. My oldest daughter, I have 3 daughters, said to me, it would be nice if you would be at home sometimes to hear my music lessons and to help me with my homework. So this puts me, she was born in 1944, so we are coming up to then the late 40s, I guess. And that's when it dawned on me that I needed to think in terms of some other things. There was a second daughter then, and to consider, and that's when I went back to graduate school and completed the work which had been interrupted by becoming married. So time-wise, that helps me pin down why it was that I did the concentration. When I went back to school, it was to take a different course altogether. I moved into counseling. And that was going back to school just doing what I was encouraging other people to do, to take a few classes because I was doing this interspersed with these other things. And finally, one of my dear friends who happened to be the registrar at Atlanta University said, if you would declare yourself as a full-time student, as a formal student, and take the examination in French and the examination in this, and take this basic class, then you won't need but 2 more courses to finish your. I had been going and taking things for the fun of taking it, and then when he put it like that, I said, well, it would make sense to enter into some kind of formal program. And that pushed me into away from the Atlanta world and the other things and the adult education services at the Y, and into high school counseling. And my first assignment as a high school counselor was back in East Point. And the way the houses were situated in the room where I was located, I could see the house where I was born from the room where I taught, because in those days you taught part-time and counseled part-time. That was when they were trying to see, is there such a thing as a need for counseling, or is this a frill that we can do without?
This was South Fulton High School, is that right?
South Fulton High School in East Point.
Where you began, I think, if I remember from our last conversation, it was 1950 or 51.
Yes,
okay.
That's right. So with Mr. Frank McLaren, and Mr. McLaren was one of those unsung heroes honored by the city of East Point, because he was one person who brought education for black youngsters to the front. Championship athletic teams. We have, I don't know that I could back this up, but just from viewing things, I believe we have as high a proportion of earned doctorates from that deprived school, South Fulton High, as any other school would have, if not more, in science, in psychology, in mathematics, in history. So it was a range of good experiences that encouraged many of the students I knew to go ahead and do well.
It's striking in this how often your comments just anticipate my question, because I was going to ask for sort of a profile of the kinds of students you were teaching at South Fulton.
One is being honored in 3 days as an outstanding woman of the year. She teaches, well, she is the head of the department at Fernbank that uses the microscope for biological purposes. It has some fancy name, but she has an earned doctorate in biology from Atlanta University. She is internationally respected. Her name is Maggie Patricia Ann Hurd, and the Patricia in her name comes from my mother, and the Maggie comes from the black woman who was the supervisor of education for what they called Negro schools in Fulton County back in those days. There is a young man who is head of the psychology department at South Carolina State, who was being primed to be one of our test cases to integrate Georgia Tech. I had him in 8th grade, and while everybody else was doing something, then there were special materials that we used with him with this in mind, because he came from the area of Hapeville, and Hapeville, where I later worked, had blacks using Hapeville as a post office address, but no blacks lived in Hapeville. The students at South Fulton were bused in from Hapeville from Fairburn, from Palmetto, from now the Niskey Lake Ben Hill area of Atlanta, and they had to take the buses to come past uh, several schools for whites to get to South Fulton, but they did that. We have students who have just done magnificent work in business areas, several ministers, one who is in the history department of a state-operated university. We've had professional football players, professional basketball players, professional baseball players to come from South Fulton. These are people who didn't just pass through but had careers in major league opportunities. There's a South Fulton graduate who is chairman of the science department at Spelman College.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at them and see that they are now retiring, I said, oh my, oh my. And I knew them when they were 8th grade.
To what do you attribute all of this, apart from their contact with you, which was clearly the instrumental part, but what was going on at South Fulton at that time?
I think one of the major things, and I just regret that it is still not widely in practice, being widely practiced today, is that when youngsters came to that school, they met a professional staff of people who were just not teachers, but who were friends, who were surrogate parents, who were motivators, inspirers, and disciplinarians, and gave to each student the feeling, a sense of worth. And what Jesse Jackson now says, if you can see it, you can perceive it, you can achieve it. That was the whole sense of the school.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knew everybody. And whatever a talent was, in the music department, there were people who would come in with their first introduction. And I talked to a young man who's now another of our doctorates in music, very talented organist and pianist and instructor of music. We have one who sings professionally, who's got started in music at South Fulton. But it's because people cared enough to find you and to help you find your spot. And once you found that spot, that you could not be satisfied sitting on that spot, but you had to wear out that spot and move on for another spot. That to me was the sense of family that you had at South Fulton. The communities, College Park, Hateville, Fairburn, Palmetto, it just was not one big community. But there were no gang struggles. Fairburn people against Palmetto, or Palmetto against East Point. And they all pulled together, which I think is a missing ingredient in today's schools and with today's young people. So that is what I would say, not that any one person, but it was a matter of a cooperative sense that Mr. McLaren led the way. Mm-hmm. He didn't sit off isolated. He never missed an athletic event at the school. The kids would go on a bus, he'd stay until the end of school, then he'd get in his car and beat a trail to wherever they were. We as faculty people went to the events that our students did, so you would know when somebody did something, and then you could say the next morning, good job, or whatever. And that was what happened, I think, to inspire many of these were first-time high school graduates, first family person, first person in the family to graduate. Um, they went on and became the first to do something else, and whatever. But this was basic to that. I worked later in Hapeville, and then I worked later back in East Point, and I found something different about each location where I worked. But I have retained ties with all of the students from wherever I worked, and now with their children, and now I know a few grandchildren of people where I work, but each was different. My mother always said when we tease her about showing preference for my oldest brother, she says, I've known him longer. And that's the way I would say about South Fulton. It isn't that one is more than any other, but I think I knew South Fulton first and longer, and maybe I'm partial to them. They keep up with me, so I keep up with them.
Returning the compliment. It was also in the early 1950s that you were working to bring the PTA to South Fulton parents.
I
Is
worked,
that right?
yes, when I went to South Fulton. This was a thing that Mr. McLaren was very much in favor of because parents wanted to do. And in those days, we wanted parents to be a part of the school. So my children were in school in Atlanta, which had its own business with PTAs. But active parents in the College Park, East Point, Fairburn, Palmetto area had their own PTAs, and their interest and activities were not doing some of the things for which PTA has taken a bad rap, that they would be tea and cookie functions. People through PTAs at South Fulton were concerned about adequate bus transportation so that the children would not have to try to find a nickel or a dime to ride the streetcar or the bus or to walk several miles to school. The lunchroom business of cafeteria service for children who had to leave home or walk. Things about providing band uniforms so that there could be a snappily dressed band going off with the athletic teams. And things that had merit in parenting skills and health services, things of that nature. So when the parents wanted us to work with them, we wanted to work with parents, and that was my real introduction to working with PTA at a school where I was employed as opposed to being a parent and working with PTA, and that is a big difference.
I'd like to say a little bit more about that difference, but I want to be sure I understood one thing correctly, which is that in the early 1950s when you arrived at South Fulton, there wasn't a PTA organization, but that the parents were indicating that they did want one.
They had,
and looking to the school
they
personnel.
had the beginnings of PTAs.
Okay.
And let me say, this same Ida Prather, who was the ball of fire behind the YWCA, was a Fulton County principal. She was an elementary school principal. And Mrs. Prather worked with the teachers because she was president of the Teachers Association. She was agitating for camping provisions in the YWCA. She was agitating for anything that anybody else had that her children needed. So they did have PTA, but it was as a new school came up, a new elementary school was built in East Point, right adjacent to South Fulton. Because when I went, they had just moved from having grades 1 through 11. See, they only had 11 grades in most schools. And they first had to get the 12th grade, which is common now. So people were active, and they did have a PTA because the PTA movement was going right along. And about this time, Mrs. Henry Butler had moved to a national organization, and it was known as the Colored Congress of Parents and Teachers. And Mrs. Butler, being from Georgia, people supported her. And the PTAs were of the area formed into what was then called the Atlanta District Council. That took in, well, with a few schools for blacks. You had a school or so here, and one or two there, and one or two there. But the Atlanta district was Atlanta and DeKalb and Fulton and Cherokee. We go up to Canton, Georgia. All of these were a part of the same area grouping for the PTA. Then when the parents found that I was interested in working with them and working with their children, then I became involved with the Colored Congress of Parents and Teachers. When I went into work at Hapeville High School, which must have been 1969 when I went to Hapeville, I was invited to join a committee of the then merged PTA.
Mm-hmm.
Because throughout that time I had worked with various things PTA and had helped to document the dissolution of the Black Congress. The Colored Congress is what it was called. So in 1969, I was invited to become active with the then Georgia Congress of Parents and Teachers without any designation for race. And I worked with that group. In fact, I'm still active with the PTA and served as an officer, first black officer, as secretary, and then second vice president and first vice president. Because of demands on time, not that I would have been elected, but I was invited to accept a nomination for president, which I had to decline because of the commitment. That kind of responsibility would have been office responsibilities and traveling, and that I didn't have time to do.
Mm-hmm.
Not the way it should have been done. And it was several years later that a very fine young man was our first black president. His name is Norman Thomas, who works now with Community Outreach Services for the Atlanta Board of Education. Fortunately, PTA was important to an assistant superintendent of Fulton County Schools. His name was Knox Walker. And Knox Walker had the honor of being the first man to ever serve as president of the state PTA. His interest made it easy for me to have some time to do things with the PTA. And I was very pleased to serve on the state board. At the time, my assistant superintendent was on the state board. That was a nice way to get a door open for me. Otherwise, it might not have had the same ending to the story.
Right. One of the things I'm curious about, and it seems like your position both as a teacher and as a parent during this time, really dovetails into this. But I'm wondering about the role of the PTAs, and I guess I'm thinking specifically of the black PTAs in this case, in the whole issue of desegregation as it evolved over the late 50s and 1960s in Atlanta.
There was an old television program which where Hazel, I guess, who was the housekeeper, always said, "Now that's a doozy." That question is a doozy because I think of it from different little compartmentalized things. There were parents who wanted to push for desegregation. At the same time, you had black parents who were being pushed thumbs down on whatever you do because of the threat of job loss or the threat in when they could hear and read about bummings and all of this. Then there were some parents who were all fired up and said, but we've got to do. So when you think in terms, when you ask a blanket question like that, how did parents, I have to qualify that by saying some parents, all deliberate speed was not fast enough. And there were some others who said, but it's always been like this. Why do you want to? And I think as we go back and review the documentaries on the whole business of school desegregation, integration, or whatever, that it becomes an important idea. 20 years later, we can see that some things are better, some things have not changed, some things are worse. How might I be more specific with this? I think one common thread that went through how parents reacted is evidenced in the absence of bloodshed and violence. Fulton County schools didn't have any rioting. Atlanta schools didn't have any rioting. There were no bricks to be thrown and dogs to be turned loose. So that part of it went because cool heads prevailed with the basis for what was being done. Then this area was fortunate, East Point, College Park, Fulton County, Atlanta schools, because with the Atlanta University Center students taking the lead. And right here in Atlanta, at the height of television as a way of getting news out to people, then we could see familiar sights, the Clockett Riches or the whatever, or we could relate to what happened at Brown High School or what happened at Georgia Tech a little better than someone could have maybe inside.
I'd like to hear just a little bit more of your impressions about the media and its importance in this matter.
Well, I think the media served a twofold purpose. We were fortunate that we did not have people with the media inciting to riot, but just at that point a declaration of news. I remember that my daughter, Pat, my oldest daughter, was a freshman at Spelman. We looked up one day while we were watching the early evening news in the kitchen, and there she was with her picket sign going under the clock at Richards. We did not object to her picketing, did not object to her participating in the protest. And I guess she figured that we wouldn't, or maybe it didn't bother her, but when we knew it, we saw her. Speaking of people who were at the forefront with that, again was a South Fulton student, Ben Brown, who was later to move forward into law, and to become a member of the Georgia General Assembly, and later to have major responsibilities with the Democratic National uh, Committee. Started South Fulton College Park, and he was a part of that first wave of student protesters. That went along, and at that time, those of us who were parents could only fix a big pot of soup on Saturday and a big pan of cornbread and take it to the hungry children who had been protesting. In the meantime, I had a little protest going, and it was my first experience in walking a picket line. And I was with this brother, Oliver Wendell Holmes, I told you about, who was with the Georgia Council. And I was picketing a liquor store. And as people would drive down the street, they would yell over and say, "Hey, Alice," and of course I felt that I had to respond. And finally he walked a little faster behind me, and without raising his voice said, "Remember, you're on the picket line and you don't talk to folks." But I was just having a good time.
Did he want you to be more serious
He
about it?
wanted me not to get the whole boycott in trouble because I was having a good time conversing with my friends as they passed up and down the street.
And this was a picket of a liquor store
Because
for public accommodations,
for
desegregation?
unfair treatment of black employees and the attitudes of the owners. That liquor store went out of business. Don't know whether it was because they didn't want to yield to the things that were being asked of them, or whether they just lost their business because people wouldn't cross picket line. But
Was this a protest organized by the Georgia Council on Human Relations, or by the students with the Georgia Council coming in?
at that point, it was hard to tell who was doing what because things just happened, and many things were promoted by the adults and operated by adults, and the students would cooperate. Then, of course, the students had their own agenda, and at that time, the adults of Atlanta felt that even the college presidents who issued their manifesto, and I think you might be interested in reading that, agreed that we have to support our students. So it was not a matter of who was the chief and who were the ball players, who was the quarterback or who were the players, but it was a matter that it was some things just happened. And this business, that was the first of my getting on a picket line, and I had a good time. It happened to be a warm day, so I enjoyed it, and I went back to some other picket lines. But the whole spirit of how we do things will make a difference. I think my mother and my father sort of instilled into us some things that I know are guiding my actions as of today. One of the things I remember most about my daddy was when I was something maybe 5, 6 years old at the most. I went with him when he was making his calls, making his rounds. And I was in a very hotbed section of the city. It was over close to the University Center, but it was called Beaver Slide, which was a very rough part of Atlanta. And I would get out of the car or sit in the car while he was there. Anyway, while we were down at the bottom of Fair Street, this person came up and wanted to be nice and speak to this little girl. And I guess I was tired or worn out or just I don't know what, but I didn't respond in the manner that my daddy thought I should have responded. And he didn't embarrass me, but you know how they say, "Oh, what a nice little girl," or wanting to make conversation, and I chose at that time not to participate in a conversation. When we went home, he said to me, and I'll never forget it, "Baby doll," that's what he called me. "You are going to be nice." He didn't say, "I want you to be." He says, "You are going to be nice to everybody." And you will find that being nice to everybody will make you feel better. And one other thing, I want you to speak up to everybody. And I don't want you drawing back from people because you don't know whose $2 put the shoes on your feet. I use that example now when I go various places, whatever it is we're talking about. You don't know whose $2 contributed to your salary as you do whatever. Or you don't know whose $2 bought a brick to go on this building that you want to get put up. You don't know whose $2 in the tax pot is helping to do whatever. And that has stayed with me. While he was doing that, getting us to be considerate and kind and working with all kinds of people wherever they were, that kind of thing, wanting equal rights, came back. My father and two of my brothers, Tup and Oliver, were successful litigants to open public accommodations in recreation to the city of Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
That was their way of paying back to people what they could do. And when I went through my counseling training, I worked for 3 years in the Johnson's War on Poverty as the representative from Fulton County Schools to the Neighborhood Youth Corps. And that was the program to provide job training and job opportunities for deprived children.
But before we get into that, because I actually want to spend quite a bit of time on that, I wouldn't. Can we take a few minutes to follow up on? I have a few follow-up questions on what you've been saying
Surely.
so far. I have a recollection from when we were talking before, the reference you just made to your father and brothers as litigants. That was in the case for the desegregation of golf courses. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So then this was in 57 or 58?
It was the first of the, it started much sooner than that, and it took years and years and years for it to be successfully concluded. But this was a joint project with lots of people. We were talking about who did what. There were a lot of people who stayed behind the scenes and provided encouragement or financial support of NAACP or whatever. I remember that Hartsfield was the mayor, and there were people who thought that this was not a proper use of time nor money because golfing was not the usual thing for most people. But it was later determined that once one part of a recreational program was desegregated, then all of it would come. So this predated many of the other civil rights cases in the city. My brother Oliver was a minister. He had finished theological school and was a minister in Alabama, and my brother Tup was here in Atlanta with his family, and the three of them with Charles Bell, who was a real estate broker, decided that they could not be frightened out of pushing forward for this. It's interesting how people do things, how people find you. At that point, there were those people who wanted me to use my influence with my father and my brothers to call off what they thought was unnecessary. And of course, I didn't view it as unnecessary, so I would not have gone through that process anyway. And if I may jump to 20 years later maybe, when my nephew Hamilton Earl Holmes and Charlene spent their first day at the University of Georgia on desegregation, I was working then at South Fulton High School. And I had this call to come to the office to answer the telephone. And it was a crank call telling me that this brother Tup had been fatally wounded as he tried to go with his son to the University of Georgia. And I am just so sorry to be the one to tell you. And he's at he was pronounced at St. Mary's Hospital. And I don't know what made me not panic, but I said one thing I remember was there violence. And this voice on the other end said yes. And with that I said thank you and hung up. With that I had the presence of mind to remember that I had befriended a person in the media who wanted a plant that I had bought for our new location. And the person at the nursery, which was a part of the J.C. Penney store at Lakewood Stewart Shopping Center, said, I know who bought that plant. It's that little lady who drives that white Rambler station wagon and works at South Fulton High School. And we'll try to find out how you can get in touch with her. Well, this gentleman was the chief of a news bureau and had been looking all through Florida and South Georgia for what it was that I had just happened to pick up at J.C. Penney, not knowing what it was. He went back to the school and described his need for knowing somebody who worked over there who drove a little white Rambler station wagon. And the custodian told him who I was and where to find me. Didn't have a telephone number, but he told him where I lived, and the gentleman came. And he said he had been looking all over and had traced down plants to this place, and they had told him that I had bought them, and he would give me anything I asked if I'd let him have the plants. I said, you may have them with my compliments. I'm pleased that you would want them enough to go through this. If I used them, they probably would die anyway. He knew the difference in the male plant and the female. I said, just take them all. He gave me his card and said, if ever you need me, let me know. This must have been October, September. January, when they went to the University of Georgia, it struck me and I called. And I said, I have had this telephone call. Is there any truth to it? He said, I'll get on with the tape. And I'll get on the line and I'll call you back. And he called back in just a matter of a few minutes to say that somebody had been nosy enough to find me. Unrelated. See, I'm a Washington. They were Holmeses. I don't know how they made the association, but they did. And to let me know. So, giving him some plants saved me some peace of mind. But that business, and I hopped 20 years with that, but that business of whose $2 put the shoes on your feet provided for me 3 of the happiest years I've ever had. It was not that of my knowing and doing or even caring that I was the first black employee of Fulton County to work countywide in a program. I just did a job, and it happened that I was working with black children and white children in all of the schools over the 72 miles long that Fulton County is. I eventually moved from being a counselor with that program to being the director of that program, which meant that I moved then to working with the superintendents of 5 school systems to plan and to coordinate and to receive signatures for whatever we were going to bring back to for salaries or finding job opportunities or commitments and statements of interest, all of these things that the government required. So that was a very pleasant 3 years, which I enjoyed because of, as I look back at it now, who's $2, put shoes on your feet, what difference does it make? You treat people as people.
And those 3 years were 64 to 67, or
That's
no,
right.
no.
Yeah, that's about when
That
it
was,
was.
or 65
I
to
had
68.
just gone to Eva Thomas High School when it opened, and again, that was because of these parents saying what they wanted.
Mm.
Eventually, South Fulton was not the only high school, but parents were able to get for College Park, the high school.
Mm-hmm.
They had first received the transportation, then they wanted the school. And that school was built as Eva Thomas High School. It is now College Park Elementary School. One thing that I have to say jokingly, but still with a serious bent, is every school where I worked, I put what I call the kiss of death on it because it is no longer in business. I worked at South Fulton, it's gone. Thomas High is gone. Hateful High is gone. I moved to Headland High, that's gone. Then from Headland I went to Woodland as the high school. It's gone, and there's now middle school. So everywhere I worked in Fulton County, I put the kiss of death, and it has gone plunk.
This period with the Neighborhood Youth Corps and the War on Poverty, you were saying that you weren't quite sure how you were tapped to do this. Is that right? How you were approached?
Well, one of those things came, and back in some days you got special calls about there is this as a possibility, you know. So it's not a matter, and I often say earlier that I can be sassy about Fulton County because I never applied to work there. They sent for me, and when I replied, they knew what they were getting. I was in school back at AU with Frank McLaren, who was the principal. When he discovered that there was going to be such an animal as a counselor in the white schools, he wanted one for South Fulton. I was in one of these classes for the fun of it, and he came to me one day and he said, after I had made a report in class, he says, "You're going to be my counselor." And I said, "I am," or some such. The next few days he brought in the application, and he said, as he only Frank McLaren could say, "Bring this back to me tomorrow." You know how there are some people you don't question, do what they say do. He took the application in the next few days he said, "I'd like for you to call so-and-so and talk to him." And with that, I became the counselor. Well, when we were doing things in those days, there were certain things that came up. Fulton County was to be a major partner. In fact, Fulton County with this was like Fulton County is as a school system. Atlanta is independent. Fulton is that portion designated by the state to provide education. So Fulton was the major signer for this part of Johnson's War on Poverty, and they wanted somebody, and I was that person.
What attracted you to doing that work, to make you want to leave teaching?
Well, I was by that time a full-time counselor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, had more periods for counseling, maybe one class, because that again was the requirement. And I think it was the opportunity to do something of a different nature, but still something that was related. I had to leave a school, and we worked out of downtown. I was still paid by Fulton County Schools, although it was paid with government money. You know how those projects went in the heyday of grants and projects. But it was with the understanding that when or if that project changed, that I could always come back
Mm.
So it wasn't a matter of just leaving, but it was a matter of being reassigned. That was a very interesting time. And because I was working with this kind of project and the desegregation of schools was on the on the front of the burner, I spent 2 years and a portion of a third year maybe working with the National Conference of Christians and Jews. I started with them on a panel which was developed to support rearing children of goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a community-based effort to have parents to understand that school desegregation was not the end of the world. There were 5 of us who would go to various churches to have little discussion with people who were interested and would bother to come or wanted to hear the message. We would go throughout the metropolitan area, and many of our visits were arranged by the Council on the Community Relations arm of city government. And Reverend Nat Welch, I believe, was the person at that time. But
Is, is this the
I
Community Relations Commission or something else?
this was the city, not the Georgia Council on Human Relations, but the Community Relation Commission. Nat
Mm-hmm.
Welch was there, and later Sam Williams, who was also pastor at Friendship Church, worked with the same group. Well, the Council of National Conference of Christians and Jews, Atlanta location, took this as their way of doing things. And working with that panel eventually put me on some other things. And I worked with the American Friends Association, and I worked with the other activities of the Council of Christians and Jews. But it all stemmed from my initial work with being a panelist to say that, children are children.
Mm-hmm.
And if we leave them alone, and if we watch what we say and how we say things at home, then they don't pick up our biases. That was how we did this. There was a person who was wife of the rabbi at the temple. There was one who was a member of the Atlanta Board of Education, a community volunteer. I remember where she lived off of Northside Drive, and I was the only black, but their effort was to get Protestant and Jew and black and white so that we truly represented
Mm-hmm.
uh, a spectrum.
Was this during the same years that you were working on the war on poverty, or slightly later?
Same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that I could do because the Office for the Christians and Jews was next to what is now the Federal Reserve Building. And the office where I worked was at 101 Marietta Street at the corner of, right across the street. So I could go over and do things or meet people or do whatever. And fortunately, my children were a little older then, and I didn't have to worry about music lessons and homework quite as much.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it was something that I wanted to do. And my children and my husband and my brothers and my parents were always ready to pitch in to do what they needed to do so that I could get out to do something.
I'd like to hear a little bit more detail about the kind of work that you did in the Neighborhood Youth Corps. What kinds of programs were you setting up, and what were your goals?
Well, we had guidelines which were national, which of course we had to follow. And one was that we met the economic standards. That was the first. One of, and that is an easy thing for people to say, But when you think in terms of the implications of this, and some people are able to find out that you are, again, an old folks expression, poor as a church mouse. But have you say this without robbing you of your dignity and telling you, yes, you are poor. That, I think, was the challenge that came as we had to develop a staff ready to go out and meet with all kinds of people. And I cannot say it too much. I was fortunate to have been told about the $2 in the shoes. Many people, most people, have never had that as a way of having things expressed to them. Mm-hmm. And because they are now at a given point where they consider themselves successful, they don't really relate to people who are not as successful, or not have had the same opportunities, being born with a golden spoon in the mouth or whatever. But that was a challenge that I took as my responsibility to see to it that other people were able to work with people whose the fact that they were poor was not of their doing, and that we wanted to work with them to help them move from point A to point B without reminding them that you way back down here somewhere. So with that in mind, your programs within what you were told you had to do were sort of a little adult education, a little sensitivity training, a little all of those things, which would have other adults, black adults and white adults, understand that no, you can't have just the schools that are predominantly white. You've got to work with a caseload. And no, you don't work with the smartest of the poor, this kind of thing. But what we did was to arrange those things which would make a difference. For some people who had never been introduced to public transportation, it meant introducing them to public transportation. For those who had never had a job, and most of them had never had a job, it was what is my responsibility to the person so that I do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. This was with adults and with children alike because we were working 16 to 21 years.
I was interested in that because so much of what you were saying, I was thinking this isn't just about youth and students. There was this other component.
So you had all of this. Then we had what people will be good role models. Now, we were doing role models 25, 26 years ago. We were being mentors. This is no new invention of 1993. And this same Ben Brown that I talked about with the integration of our facilities and part of student protest was then a member of the General Assembly. And I remember one of my assignments was Russell High School in East Point. I remember having Ben Brown to come to talk to students from East Point, where black students and white students were gathered in the auditorium at Russell High School to hear this newly elected black representative who had grown up in College Park come and talk. Mm-hmm. And he was not talking about how you do a protest. He was talking about the advantages of being well read and interested and how you mix and mingle with all kinds of people. Mm-hmm. So you had to plot strategy and pick people who would come and say things and do things to help them. We had to fight the obstacle of manual labor only for black students.
Meaning jobs involved, placing
Menial,
them in
menial
jobs.
things. Oh, they'd say, oh, yes, we can do this. If you'll send me 5 people to cut me up, he's using my car because his is in the shop. So,
Hmm.
if all I had to do was to go to the parking lot, it'd be different. But I had said to him,
You were just saying that you were trying to convey to people that you had young women who
and
wanted other
this is
skills.
true, and I think that was a major accomplishment of our program, that we were able to say to young people that you don't have to restrict your talents to doing this kind of menial job, and at the same time to say to teachers or to people in nonprofit organizations who were giving work experience time to our students that you too must broaden your view and say, just because this is a black female, that she can't do anything but what you are accustomed to seeing black females do. One of the programs that we established was to develop with the Atlanta Board of Education a system for processing library books. The old plan had been to send a box of books to a school, and the professional librarian had to do all of the processing to get that book on the shelf. That's to write the numbers on the spine, to paste the jacket in, to do whatever was being done, which was valuable time being taken away from library services. Working with Mrs. Dorothy Blake, who was the head of media services, we came up with a plan to have a group of young people. We had boys and girls, black and white, male and female, to do an assembly line kind of thing, where they would open the books, and with an adult they would count the number of titles of copies of a given title, and then one would do this, one would do that, one would do the other, and at the end of the day you had several sets of books processed, and the only thing that had to be done was to be sorted and counted and sent to the school. That was a lesson that young people could do, because they could transfer that skill to something later as a job. And 1 or 2 people did become library aides, assistants, because of that experience. And it was accepted by the Atlanta Board of Education on Dorothy Blake's um, selling of that idea. That it continued after, so that we were able to make life easier for school media people,
Hmm.
and not having them to go through that routine processing, instead of being able to surface reference questions or to give library skills to classes or to do whatever it is that they do best. One of the other things that we did was to write in a component for health services. That I was very proud of. We had initiated a proposal to have a comprehensive health program for students. Because again, with deprived children who don't have private doctors and who don't have the time to spend all day at the graded clinic, if they had the money to get to the graded clinic, we were able to provide some things which gave, as a component of our program, medical services. I was proud of that. Uh, I often wonder what would have happened to some of them if we had not been able to get that service. So what we did by way of programs was left to the willingness of a given staff to go beyond the call of duty, to go beyond the guidelines sent from Washington. One, I always had to have some fun with what we did. Working out of Washington, the Department of Labor, we soon became accustomed to a telegram being delivered first thing in the morning saying, by the end of the day, please let us have. And no matter what you were doing, if they wanted whatever, you did it for them. And I would go in when I was the director, and I would say, Washington says, and they'd say, now, which one? Which one? And we'd say, Washington says we're going to take the day off. Which one? So, but, you know, it does get frustrating when you get orders, and that's really what it amounted to. By the end of the day, let us have. That was just common language of government work. So we would put a little life in it. One of the bad parts of that experience was working with people who thought that because they were so and so, that they could call and tell you, I want 3 jobs, I have 4 children I'm sending, and you will do this. And it was interesting that they would all wait for me to be the one to say, you know, I appreciate you realizing that we are down here and what we're doing, but unfortunately we're unable to help you with your request. And they would sit there, they meaning staff, would sit and listen, you know, as to how I would say to this person, supposedly in a high position, that we cannot honor what you're saying because you are not within the boundaries. This is not the kind of thing we do. We don't recruit in this manner, you know.
These were, I just want to be sure I understand this right, these were people who were calling in and saying, I would like workers. Is
No,
that right?
these were people who wanted you to put some of their friends or their neighbors
Okay.
or their whatever to work, a little patronage system.
Mm-hmm.
And of course it takes all kinds of people, and some of these people to whom I had to give a very firm no were people who understood and would not have had me really bend the rule if they had been thinking, you know. So you win some battles and win some friends, and you don't lose your integrity in the process. But that was a very interesting experience. When I went away from Neighborhood Youth Corps, I worked for a few summers after being back in the high school with the Fulton County summer program. So that kept me with the opportunity to see some things, looking at it from a different point of view. So I guess I had maybe 3.5 years and 3 summers working with youngsters for whom a second chance meant everything.
One thing I'd like to just follow up on is I've read various reports that have been written about the war on poverty in Atlanta, particularly through Economic Opportunity Atlanta, and I thought I picked up a sense in these reports that people working in the war on poverty, such as yourself, and particularly with the school board, found it difficult to work with the school board on these matters, found the school board resistant, I guess would be the best word. But there was just a sense that I picked up, and I wondered if you would agree or disagree with that.
At that time, you had a white school board. You had people, as people of any persuasion, may be resistant to change. I found that something new had to be introduced as something new, and that you could not put, but we've always done it this way, because you had never done it this way. And the approach which was used as I had to go with rural school superintendents and urban school superintendents was not difficult, because when I would go, it was the effort to explain what was in the wind. Would you go along with it? Because the whole project, and there were two components. One was for school students, and then there was one for community people. There was an in-school and an out-of-school. And the in-school component had to be approved with signatures from all of these superintendents, which meant that at the time I was director, I met with 5 school superintendents and in some instances 5 sets of attorneys for school boards. But I never had to go to school boards because the superintendents did the signing for me. So I can't say how individual school board members felt, but I never had a signature that I needed that I didn't get. Now, that I think is a good summation of how I was able to do this. And I don't know that there was any extra persuasion on my part. I think it was a matter that school superintendents viewed this as good business.
Happy to have the money that was coming in.
This is true because we did not pay supervisors, but if people who were needing summer work could supervise 15 youngsters, and those 15 youngsters could put the sod on an athletic field for 1/20th of what professional landscaping would cost, then the school system saved money. And it was not a matter that youngsters were just outside doing hard work, but this was how they learned, and we saw to it that you learned which grasses are put down in which manner, and the mixtures of whatever you had to do, and the watering that goes along with it, and the regularity with which you have to perform things if you want to have the end result that you are trying to get. So we didn't have any major difficulty, and I think I would remember any major difficulty that might have come around through that. But the in-school program, I think, very much like Head Start, are two things which were outstanding portions of the war on poverty, which we might do well to reuse
Bring
again.
back again.
Bring back. Not reinventing the wheel, but unemployed youngsters in school and out of school, children needing daycare and Head Start so that they go to school, actual big school as they called it, ready. You know, those things from Head Start, they were proven successes.